While a family day hike might sound like the least dangerous thing on this channel, and almost every other time you'd be right, these 5 actually became the most unsettling example I have that even a really peaceful looking day hike can doom an entire family in one night. Welcome to Wild Stories with Joshua, and this is the story of a family of 5 from Pennsylvania who drove out for one ordinary Saturday hike in the Appalachians and never made it back to the car. It was the 20th of April, 2019, in the Dolly Sods wilderness in eastern West Virginia, during the spring period when access roads onto the plateau were beginning to reopen after their winter closures, using Forest Road 75, which was accessible at the time. The lower country the family drove through had been running warmer than the plateau typically does this time of year, and Curtis Paget recalled the parking area already busy when he arrived before dawn, and said he remained in the area into the morning. The clothing they were photographed wearing that morning was consistent with relatively mild conditions rather than prolonged cold exposure, and that is the entire problem with this story. Their names were Randy and Donna Sedlak, and they were from Greensburg, Pennsylvania, roughly a 3-hour drive from the Dolly Sods area. Randy was 53 and had spent 26 years installing and servicing heating and cooling systems. Donna was 50 and worked at a credit union. They had been married 27 years. Family members and friends did not describe either parent as an experienced backcountry hiker, and neither of them ever claimed to be. What they had instead was decades of managing ordinary family life, the kind that gets a family of 5 out the door on time with lunches packed and everybody's boots in the car, which is a different thing from experience in exposed backcountry conditions. What they were, by every account from the people who knew them, was a family that did this. Her sister said the hiking started when the children were small and cheap entertainment mattered, and that it simply never stopped, even after the kids were grown and it would have been easier to let it go. They had a standing thing, 3 or 4 long day hikes a year, usually somewhere within a half-day's drive, usually chosen by whoever had complained the least about the last one. Dolly Sods had been on the list for 2 years. Donna had put it there after somebody at work showed her a photograph of the open ground up top, and she could not believe it was in West Virginia. Her sister said she brought it up every spring and something always got in the way, and that this was finally the year nothing did. Before this goes further, I want to clarify that these weren't thrill seekers or reckless idiots. They made a string of ordinary-looking calls that each seemed fine on their own, and together left them with no margin at all. The 3 children were all adults by then, which is the detail that makes this so much harder to sit with because all 3 of them went with their parents. Ian was 24 and worked as a welder, and friends later described him as the strongest of the 3 and said he usually carried more than the others. Corinne was 21 and had just finished her 3rd year at a state school, studying to be a physical therapist. Nolan was 18 and had graduated high school the previous spring, and 2 of Ian's friends later told investigators that Nolan had been the one pushing hardest for this particular trip after he had seen photographs of the place online. He was starting an apprenticeship in the autumn. All 3 of them still lived within 15 minutes of the house they had grown up in, which is part of why losing them took out most of one family in a single night. To understand what happened to them, you have to understand what Dolly Sods really is, because it does not look like anywhere else in the Appalachians, and it does not behave like anywhere else either. It is a high plateau in the Monongahela National Forest, roughly 17,400 acres of open heath and bog and wind-stunted spruce sitting above 4,000 feet, with plants and conditions more typical of areas much farther north. The plateau was logged bare more than a century ago and then burned, and what grew back is not really a forest at all across much of it, just open barren ground, boulder fields and standing water, with many of the spruce permanently bent by the prevailing wind. The Forest Service says plainly that freezing temperatures can occur there in any month of the year, and that snow can be expected from October through April, any month of the year. That is not a warning written for winter. It is written because the plateau can be dramatically colder, windier, and cloudier than the valley around it, sometimes within a very short distance. Keep this in mind. The weather where they parked that morning was completely manageable, and it stayed that way just long enough for them to get deep into the plateau. Forest Road 75 runs across the high country itself, so the trailheads it serves already sit up around 4,000 feet. The family were standing in the exposed high country the moment they got out of the car, and on that particular morning it was pleasant. That is the trap. Add wind, open ground with nothing to break it, and a surface that holds water like a sponge, and conditions that feel entirely reasonable in a busy parking lot can become something else entirely a few hours out across the plateau. Guides to the area routinely emphasize that conditions can matter more than mileage. People who go once months, on the first nice Saturday of the season, have no particular reason to know any of that. The trails do not help. Dolly Sods has nearly 50 miles of them, many following old railroad grades and logging roads, crossing at numerous junctions and side routes. There is no continuous painted blaze system of the kind hikers expect from the Appalachian Trail. Junctions are marked by signs instead, but signs can be absent, damaged, or hard to spot, and side routes are easy to miss in poor visibility. On wetter sections, standing water and bog obscure the tread, and the route becomes hard to distinguish from the game paths and old grades alongside it. In good visibility, with a map, most people manage fine. There is one more thing about that ground worth knowing, and it explains why searchers there work the way they do. From August of 1943 until July of 1944, the military used parts of Dolly Sods and the surrounding area as an artillery and mortar training range, with more than 50,000 troops training across the region. A survey of trails and known campsites in 1997 turned up 15 shells. Some of them still live, and the Forest Service warns that more ordnance remains possible because not every acre has been surveyed. Visitors are told not to touch, move, or dig around anything they suspect is ordnance, and to report it. So picture where they were going. Wide open land with nowhere to hide from the weather, ground that stays soaked, and old unexploded bombs still buried in parts of it. They left Greensburg before 6, stopped for breakfast off the interstate, and Curtis Paget's account places all 5 of them at the parking area at approximately 20 minutes past 10. Temperatures in the lower country were generally warmer than conditions typically encountered on the plateau. A forecast available that morning called for spring conditions, though investigators could not establish whether that was the forecast the family had consulted. Photographs recovered later show what they were wearing, and it is the single most important piece of evidence in this entire case. Shorts on 3 of them, cotton shirts, 2 light jackets between 5 people, trail runners, and low hikers. Each had started with a small day pack, water, and lunch. None of the recovered photographs show them wearing or visibly carrying substantial cold weather layers. The last known witness to speak with them was a landscape photographer named Curtis Paget, who was 58 and who had driven up from Maryland before dawn to shoot the eastern edge of the plateau in early light. He told investigators he had been visiting the area roughly twice a year for more than a decade, and that he spoke to the family in the parking area for about 5 minutes. They asked him about the route, and he told them the loop they were describing was longer than it looked on the map, and that the weather up there could turn. He said the father thanked him and said they had all day. He recalled Nolan asking where the best photographic views were, and Paget pointing him toward the northern side of the plateau. Paget later said he did not remember seeing anything that morning that made him believe they were in immediate danger. I've thought about Curtis a lot while working on this one. He warned them that morning, the best way he knew how, and he told investigators he still thinks about it to this day. Their phones filled in most of the rest of the day. Between them, the family took 141 photographs between 10:30 in the morning and 20 past 3 in the afternoon. Some retained location metadata, while others could be placed by comparing visible terrain with known locations, letting investigators reconstruct their route with reasonable confidence. They moved north and west across the open ground, then turned south onto the longer arm of the loop. The pictures are the pictures anybody takes out there. The 5 of them squinting into the sun, Nolan standing on a rock with his arms out, Corinne photographing one of the boggy sections. The last recovered photograph from any of the 5 phones was time-stamped 3:20 in the afternoon. It is Donna, from behind, walking, and it shows heavier cloud cover and less direct sunlight than the earlier photographs. No surviving photograph establishes why they changed course. No later photographs were recovered from any of the 5 phones, and investigators could not establish why. The loop they had picked was somewhere in the region of 15 miles. A long day for anybody, and a very long day for 5 people who hike 3 or 4 times a year. Starting at 10:30 made it longer. The reconstructed trail route put them approximately 8 trail miles from the vehicle by the later part of the afternoon, when the available evidence indicates conditions were worsening. Going back meant roughly 8 miles the way they had come. Going forward meant something in the region of 7. They were past the halfway point, and continuing looked marginally shorter than turning around, which is the kind of arithmetic that sounds perfectly sensible right up until it isn't. Crossing directly through the interior would have meant leaving the trail for boggy, uneven ground, and cell coverage was unreliable along much of the route, so they could not count on being able to call anybody for an opinion. The available evidence does not identify a single moment when the group recognized the situation had become dangerous. Conditions on that plateau can change rapidly, and by the time they become obvious, a group can already be far from its vehicle. No weather station recorded the exact conditions at the family's position elevation out on the exposed plateau, which is the point that matters. Though the plateau can experience substantially colder and windier conditions than the ground around it, even temperatures only modestly above freezing can become dangerous when combined with prolonged wetting, wind, and inadequate insulation. Here's the part that matters. Wet clothing and strong wind can pull heat right out of a body dramatically faster than air alone, even when the air is nowhere near freezing. Water transfers heat away from a body far more efficiently than still air does, and wind strips away the thin, warm layer that clothing normally traps against the skin. Neither needs the temperature anywhere near freezing to be dangerous. It is the reason cold weather guidance warns against cotton, which retains moisture against the skin and insulates far worse wet than dry, and the reason that sounds like fussy gear talk right up until the day it stops being fussy gear talk. Their clothing was recovered wet, but investigators could not determine precisely when it became saturated or how much of the moisture came from rain, bog crossings, or contact with wet vegetation. If clothing becomes thoroughly wet, in wind, on open ground with nothing to get behind, a person's heat loss can exceed their ability to replace that heat metabolically, even while the body is still generating heat, including through shivering. The recovered packs contained no emergency shelter and no substantial dry insulating layer, and there were roughly 7 miles of difficult ground between them and the vehicle. Earlier recognition leaves more options, stopping to get shelter up, dry layers on, food and fluids in, and get warm again. All of those would have been much harder with the equipment they were carrying, and everyone depends on recognizing the danger before impairment becomes severe. And this is the part that separates hypothermia from almost every other way the outdoors kills people, and the reason this story is not about 5 people making bad decisions. As hypothermia progresses, judgment, coordination, and physical performance can all deteriorate together, sometimes well before anybody looks obviously ill, which makes it increasingly difficult for a person to recognize the danger or correct it. So the decisions can get worse, and the group may not see it happening, because impaired judgment can make it increasingly difficult to recognize and respond to the danger. What the phone data established afterward says the rest. Photographs and location data placed them on segments that did not match the loop recorded in their planned route at 2 junctions, once in a way that added distance, and once in a way that took them off the intended loop entirely and onto a trail heading in the wrong direction. Neither error is remarkable on its own, and both are the kind of thing people do on that plateau in clear weather with a map in their hands. Investigators believe they increased the distance and navigation difficulty the family faced as conditions apparently worsened. Search records describe their belongings spread across nearly a mile of trail in flat administrative language. One abandoned day pack was found upright beside the trail, while the remaining packs were recovered with or near the victims themselves. A jacket about 400 yards further on. A phone, recovered with its battery, exhausted. One of the phones contained recoverable records of several attempted outgoing calls beginning around 7:41 that evening, none of which produced a completed connection. 2 partially recovered water bottles that still contained substantial amounts of water. The recovery log lists each item and its location along the route. Investigators considered the overall pattern consistent with a progressive loss of equipment or organization, though they could not determine why each item had been set down, or whether the pattern reflected declining mobility, changing decisions, or something else. Those call attempts came in around dusk. Sunset followed, and full darkness came in behind it, and by then they may have been wet for several hours, although investigators could not establish the exact duration of their exposure. Temperatures were falling after sunset in the surrounding region, while the exact conditions at their locations remained uncertain. What happened after that is reconstructed from where each of them was found, and from what investigators could establish, and it is not a story of a single moment. The distribution of the 5 bodies was consistent with gradual separation over a mile of ground in the dark, though investigators could not establish whether anyone intentionally left the group, or whether they lost contact gradually or during a single period of confusion. Visibility and wind would have made staying in contact increasingly difficult. The evidence does not show that anyone deliberately left anyone behind. It shows 5 people separated in the dark, and it can't tell us whether that happened slowly or all at once. Ian, the eldest of the 3, was found the greatest distance down the trail in the direction of the road. Investigators considered several possibilities for why he ended up farther than the others, including that he continued moving after the group began to separate, but the evidence could not establish his reason for continuing or whether it was a decision at all. What is documented is that he was found roughly 9/10 of a mile farther along than his mother before reaching the road. The alarm was raised the following day, later than anyone would want. Relatives understood the outing to be a same-day hike, but they had not been given a precise return time. When they still had not returned by Sunday morning, Donna's sister contacted police near her home in Pennsylvania, who linked the report to the family's vehicle and their planned destination and notified West Virginia authorities. Once given the family's destination, deputies checked the likely trailheads and located the vehicle Sunday afternoon, exactly where it had been left, with a folded road map and other papers on the passenger seat. A second, more detailed topographic map of the plateau was later found in one of the recovered day packs, along with a compass, which is part of how investigators were later able to identify where the group's route had diverged from what they had planned. The response brought together local law enforcement, the Forest Service, county emergency services, and trained volunteer search and rescue teams working open bog and heath in continuing cold and difficult conditions. Ground teams checked accessible trails Sunday evening, but coverage was limited by darkness, and the main systematic search began Monday morning. It is not the thing people picture. It is crews moving systematically through assigned sectors and the mapped trail network, marking what they have covered. Air resources were requested when conditions allowed. The known ordnance hazard required additional caution when teams searched away from established trails, particularly in areas without previous clearance work. Multiple agencies and volunteer search and rescue personnel joined as the search expanded, with a command post established near the access road. Cold, wet conditions were still complicating the work, and crews were rotating out on a schedule to keep anybody from going down with the same thing. I want to say clearly that nobody was slow here. The people searching that plateau were working the same cold, wet conditions on ground where leaving the trail meant extra caution. Crews worked the family's planned loop from the trailhead, because at that stage, it was the only route anybody had. A ground team sweeping one of those segments found a dropped item beside the trail, well off the line the family should have been walking, and pushed outward from there. That is what put them onto the first victim, at approximately 11:20 on Monday morning, roughly 600 yards further into open heath. Search records placed the discovery, its position, and the condition in the flat administrative language those documents always use, and noted that additional members of the missing party were believed to be nearby, and that search priorities were adjusted accordingly. Only later, once the phones were recovered and examined, did investigators work out that the search team had cut across the family's route close to the second place they had gone wrong. All 5 were located during the first operational day and a half of the systematic search, and the recoveries required litter carries over terrain vehicles could not reach. Donna and Corinne were found together. Nolan was around 200 yards away, off the trail in a stand of spruce. Randy was between them and the junction. Ian was the furthest on. The farthest 2 recoveries were less than a mile apart, and 3 were found within a few hundred yards of the mapped trail network. By the time the first victim was found, that location was a little over 5 trail miles from the vehicle, even though the family's earlier reconstructed position that afternoon had been roughly 8 trail miles away, consistent with a group that had continued moving for some distance after conditions worsened. That 5-mile distance would have been a manageable walk under ordinary conditions, though the actual terrain and conditions that night made that comparison misleading. All 5 members of the Sedlak family died on the plateau during the overnight period between the 20th and 21st of April, 2019. The West Virginia Office of the Chief Medical Examiner determined the deaths were consistent with environmental hypothermia after considering the recovery circumstances, scene evidence, autopsy findings, and toxicology, and classified the manner of death as accidental. No significant traumatic injury or natural disease sufficient to explain the deaths was identified, and toxicology did not identify alcohol, illicit drugs, or medications at concentrations considered contributory in any of the 5. The cause and manner of death come from the medical examiner. The sequence of their final movements is reconstructed separately from the recovery positions and the distances between them, which investigators considered consistent with a group that had separated gradually rather than one that scattered at a single moment. It was 5 people from one family on what looked like just another ordinary Saturday, only a few hours from their own kitchen table. It's just brutal to think that all 5 of them were found within a mile of each other. 2 details from the recoveries are worth explaining, because they get misread badly when they reach the public. 2 of the 5 were found with clothing removed or partly removed, and 1 was found having entered a confined space beneath low spruce. Both are recognized findings in some fatal hypothermia cases. As core temperature falls, thermoregulation becomes progressively less effective. Paradoxical undressing, in which a severely hypothermic person removes clothing despite dangerous cold, is a documented phenomenon, and so is a pattern sometimes called terminal burrowing. Neither finding by itself establishes what the person was experiencing, neither indicates that anybody did anything wrong, and neither on its own establishes the cause of death. Everything you have heard here is a reconstruction, and it is worth being exact about what it rests on. The morning timeline begins with Paget's account and the family's documented arrival at the trailhead. The route is reconstructed from photographs carrying location data and identifiable terrain features, while the clothing is documented in the images themselves. The weather reconstruction relies on the nearest available regional records, the terrain, the photographs, and the condition of the recovered clothing and equipment, because the available official observations do not record conditions at every point along their route, and the exact conditions they experienced remain uncertain. The route errors come from the phone data recovered afterward, not from anything the search teams knew at the time, and the records say plainly that the reconstruction is an inference. The cause and manner of death come from the medical examiner, while the sequence of their final movements is reconstructed from the scene, the recovery locations, and the digital evidence. What no reconstruction can supply is what any of the 5 of them said to each other out there, what they understood about how much trouble they were in, or whether they understood it at all. And given the documented effects severe hypothermia can have on judgment and coordination, that last question may not even have an answer. The evidence stops at where each of them was found lying. So does this. I want to be clear that not one of their decisions looked catastrophic on its own. The disaster came from stacking them, and that's exactly why this one has stayed with me longer than most. In later interviews, surviving relatives emphasized checking conditions at the actual location a hike will take place, not the town nearest to it. Check the forecast for where you are going, not for where you live, and check it for the ground you will be standing on, rather than the nearest town, because those are frequently 2 different climates and the difference can be large enough to change the risk completely. Carry a real rain layer and something warm that is not cotton, even on a warm day, even for a day hike. And understand that on high open ground, wet and wind will do in an afternoon what most people assume takes a blizzard. Dolly Sods remains a heavily visited hiking destination, and the advice given to visitors there has not changed. The access roads still reopen seasonally, weather permitting, the plateau can still be substantially colder and windier than the valley, and many routes are still unblazed. Consistent with the area's wilderness management, the underlying hazards remain what they were.